invitation to this very nice place with the long history. Actually, we talked about this morning. I've seen the 650th anniversary of the University of Pest. And what you see here on this picture is a drawing from our university headquarter building. It's an old castle in Stuttgart in the southwest of Germany. And we have just this year our 200th anniversary, so there's still a long way to catch up with your history. But actually, I can mention this anniversary because when the university was founded, it was the end of the Enlightenment period. It was 1818. And actually something happened in 1815, which was the initial event for this university foundation. It was a volcano eruption in Indonesia. The Tambora volcano erupted. It was the largest recorded volcano eruption ever. And the ash cloud was moving towards Europe. And in 816 we had in our area the year without summer. So it was a very bad harvest and the people were starving. And at that time the Herzog, the king of Württemberg, was just married with the Katharina, the daughter of the Russian Tsar, and she had the pockets full of money. Württemberg was very poor at that time, and they managed to do many things. For example, they used this old castle to install the first agricultural university in Württemberg, because they thought it's a good idea to train people better in understanding how agriculture works and to increase productivity. So it was already a knowledge-based activity, and this is also what my research is about. Actually, it takes 100 years to understand why this year was without a summer. So this relationship between the volcano eruption and the bad harvest a year later was discovered 100 years later. So it is not so easy sometimes. It takes a very long time. And I hope it's not the destiny of Asian-based models as a methodology, that it will take another 80 years or so. I think we have a history of around 20 years. But we are moving in a certain direction. Of course, there are some obstacles still and some unsolved questions, and many new approaches are developing, encouraging approaches are developing at the moment. I think I'm not of the very first generation, but maybe of the second generation in the field of agent-based modeling, because it was in a European project which started in 1999, so the last millennium, when we developed the first generation of the skin model. At that time it was called SIGN model for self-emerging innovation networks. And since then we have developed it further and adapted it to different practical applications and different experiments. And there was also a nice community, because we decided for an open source strategy developing around the world, which has made this program and this approach quite popular. And this is what we are heading to in the presentation today. But I will start with some general ideas about my personal motivation working with these kind of models, which comes from the field where I'm trained in innovation economics. As I said before, it's a knowledge-based activity that we want to analyze. And the question is whether we are reaching some bottlenecks in traditional economics when we talk about knowledge-driven developments. I guess most of you are familiar with the general ideas about innovation in industrial economics, and one of the things they do, and which I think is a major problem, they say that knowledge of companies can be approximated by money. So if you model innovation activities, you use the R&D expenditures as a proxy for the knowledge. If a company is investing a high amount of money in R&D, it is more likely to be successful. I think if you look in the real world, you see very quickly that this is not the case, because then large companies would always dominate, because they always have the large R&D budgets. But we see that new companies enter the scene, that they are surprisingly successful, and they are surprisingly also beaten established companies with the new technology. So money is not everything. It is of course very helpful also for costly R&D activities, but it is not the right variable to look at to understand innovation processes. So therefore, I start with the first block here, entitled Why are innovation networks the better alternative compared to spillovers when analyzing innovation processes. Details come in a minute. And then I go into the modeling field and show you how we have modeled innovation networks and the behavior of agents in these networks, and for what kind of discoveries we use these agent-based models. So let me begin with the very basic part, and I would like to start with an observation from growth theory. So of course we had this path-breaking work of Robert Solow in the 1950s, when he was discovering that the largest part of the growth, economic growth in the United States cannot be explained by an increase in capital and by an increase in labor, but something else, and he was labeling this something else innovation. Unfortunately, there was nothing else to explain where does this innovation comes from. He was arguing it is falling like manna from heaven, it is just there, it's not an endogenous thing economists should be interested in, it's something exogenously happening. And this is of course not convincing a lot, which also leads to say a very slow development of growth theories until the 1980s. Then on the right hand side you see Paul Romer and his colleagues. They introduced what is not very creatively then called new growth theory. They added a particular element. They say that knowledge shows the feature of the public goods. And this means that if a company creates new knowledge, more or other companies can also benefit from this knowledge. There are synergies to be created, so the sum is more than the individual parts put together, and we are observing a growing process. We are not running into diminishing returns from decreasing returns on the capital stock like in the Solow model. So this was a very nice explanation, and it focused on the idea creating features of new technological knowledge. And because of the public good features of new technological knowledge, the knowledge created by one company is available to the other companies. They cannot be excluded from using the knowledge. This is the feature of public goods. Okay, this was giving a kind of renaissance to this development in the growth theoretical realm of economics. However, the insight was not new. Already since the 1960s, with the work of Kenneth Arrow and others, these features of new technological knowledge was discussed. Knowledge was considered to be a public good. However, it was leading to the exact opposite conclusions. In industrial economics, there was an incentive-reducing interpretation of these public good features of new technological knowledge, let's call it spillovers, because companies can benefit from the R&D activities of other companies without paying for it. This is another interpretation of the meaning of public goods. And these developments, these negative considerations of the feature of public goods in innovation processes were done in the traditional modeling framework. The major points are just listed here. We have all agents which optimize. So the major motive also for deciding upon the R&D budget is profit maximization. So they are making decisions in a complete deterministic world, which also means that actually uncertainty, which is a basic feature of innovation processes, was not considered at all. It's deterministic. You know in an innovation production function already the outcome of the innovation process. The whole analysis was done in the traditional framework of equilibrium, which also says that every kind of deviating behavior from the equilibrium behavior, which is by definition an optimal state, is suboptimal and might lead to, to the exit of the agent. So it was not, say, the dynamic environment which we observe when we are looking at innovation processes. And also from social welfare theory, they take the idea of perfect competition as a benchmark. So the idea is the situation should create, the situation observed in economic reality should create the results that we find in a situation where we have perfect competition. In case there is a deviation from this, we have to intervene from a policy side, point of view. So let's start with this situation, say around the 1960s, with the work of Kenneth Arrow and the knowledge consideration as a poor public good and the interpretation as an incentive reducing effect. So the idea behind this, and I think this is very important also to understand the difference to the innovation networks that we are talking about later, is this sentence here in red. The knowledge transfer is considered to happen involuntarily. So if you are developing new knowledge, you cannot prevent others from using it. So when we are opening the windows here in the seminar room of the University of Pécs, the whole knowledge generated in this university will immediately be blown in, and we cannot escape. We are just getting this knowledge. I think this is already telling you that we are not convinced by the idea of technological spillovers, which automatically are contributing to your innovation success. And if you would like to see it in a formal representation, I have developed this very didactically purpose-only model, which shows you an innovation production function. We have some of the input factors here, and in addition, and this is what you find in the literature in all these models since the 1970s, in the 1980s, you find additionally the R&D activities, the amount of money invested in research from one company, company I, plus what is called the spillover pool, ZI. And the spillover pool is just the amount of research by all the other companies in that industry multiplied with this beta parameter, which is the spillover parameter. And the idea is that knowledge is a poor public good, so we have the spillover effects and we have free riding behavior. And this is, say, how we have conceptualized spillovers in the literature in the 1980s. So knowledge, as I said, is freely available, like these guys here are stealing the energy from the truck and taking a free ride. I guess that they don't pay, maybe they pay, but I would be surprised. So they just steal the energy, and the same is happening in our industrial development processes. We open our windows and the knowledge flows in and we are just using it. And I think this, as I said, is not convincing. Okay, but let's stick to this model. The idea is then, if beta is increasing, the spillover parameter is increasing, the share of public goods is becoming more important. In the maximum it can be 1. And if it's 1, then we have no incentives to invest in R&D at all. So we have a zero investment because everybody is behaving like a free rider, is waiting for somebody else to move, and nobody will move in this situation. Of course, in this situation, if you compare it with the solution a social planner would have for such a situation, the investment in R&D is suboptimal. It is a classical case of market failure, and this leads us to the basic answer of mainstream economics with respect to innovation and interventions as innovation policy. You see at the first answer here is the state himself has to produce the knowledge, like the state is producing the public goods. So we are considering that knowledge production is a public activity, something which has to be organized by the government. The second solution is to change the framework when knowledge is generated. The problem is that for public goods you cannot ask for property rights, so you can artificially introduce property rights. You can implement a system of intellectual property rights like the patent system, which is a so-called second best solution. So you monopolize knowledge for a while, usually for 20 years, so only the inventor is allowed to use the knowledge, or he can license out the knowledge. Nobody else can use it. But it's made public because everybody can read, of course, the patent document. And finally, the third form of strategies to answer this market failure idea is to subsidize research. So you can allow for tax credits, for example, that people who invest, despite they know they lose knowledge to competitors, they can reduce, for example, their tax loads. And then they have advantages, say, on the cost side, and might invest in R&D activities even if others are benefiting from this. Okay, so we are now really in the early 1980s, then this was state-of-the-art knowledge in the field. The question was quickly arise whether this is really the case. Can knowledge be analyzed adequately by making it equal to a public good, or are there other features which are valid? Some of the other features which were prominently discussed are, for example, the two first ones here. The firm specificity, like the tacitness, the Polanyi concept, already introduced in the mid of the 1960s. So we cannot codify everything. We cannot write down all the elements which are necessary to make use of the knowledge. And for example, if we have a patent or a paper where we write down how technology works, it is missing important concepts. You might know this from personal experience. I think a traditional example is that you cannot train somebody to ride a bicycle on the phone. So this is impossible. You have to run next to your children, to your child, and to deliver this knowledge face to face. It's the traditional master apprenticeship knowledge, if you like, or learning process. Another example which is very relevant for me is, as I like cooking and eating, I sometimes follow the recipes of some 5-star cooks, and they write down these recipes. You can buy cooking books, and the idea is that they describe how the meal is prepared, but if you do it at home, it does not taste like in this 5-star restaurant, it does not look like this. So there's a lot of other things which is relevant for the preparation of the meal. And the same holds obviously for many technologies. So even if knowledge is codified, not everything can be codified, and therefore naturally beta has to be smaller. The second thing is something which is very specific to our economic considerations about knowledge and how we implement technologies in production functions. So generally we believe that technologies are continuous. So if we have, for example, a change in the relationship between wages and capital cost, we just move it along our indifference curve and find another optimal technology which is applying the right amount of labor and capital to minimize production costs. If you talk to engineers, they say, no, this is not existing. We have a very locally defined concept of technologies, and if one of the technologies is improving, this might not be relevant, say, in a labor-intensive technology, there's a technological improvement. This improvement might not be relevant for the more capital-intensive production process. So there is no way that somebody, even if it's a public good, can make use of the knowledge if he is not exactly applying the same technology. So instead of our continuous representation of technologies, which is nice if you are involved in production theory, engineers usually work with locally defined production points, and they say it's not possible to substitute from a more labor-intensive technology just by reducing the amount of labor, and then you move into a more capital-intensive technology. Technologically, this is not feasible. So 1 and 2 is already showing you that beta generally should be smaller than 1, which means that the incentive reducing effects are not complete. And the second observation is also something which was introduced in the 1980s by 2 guys from the management camp, or one management researcher and one economist, Cohn and Leventhal. They introduced the concept of absorptive capacities. So if you want to integrate knowledge which is generated somewhere else, you cannot just open the window, but you have to do your own efforts in order to develop the prerequisites to understand this knowledge. And this is, of course, leading you to the situation where you have to develop your own knowledge.